Okay, moving on to chapter 6, the humanity of Christ, God the Son incarnate, with the emphasis on incarnate, right? Mm-hmm. That's the title of the book, but we're really looking here at the incarnation. And, I think the overall idea is that while it might be the case, and it is the case indeed, that the ontological and epistemological starting point falls in the deity of Christ. We must start with the deity of Christ. We must move to the humanity of Christ. As much as we must start with the deity of Christ, to that extent we must move to the humanity of Christ, or we will completely miss who Jesus is.
Yeah.
So, and we have 3 sections here. The presentation of the incarnation, the biblical presentation of the incarnation, why God becomes man, and his sinlessness. So those are the 3 sections that good way of just good handles on talking about the incarnation.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, let's go through and think through what issues might be snags for the students as we work through it. Overall, though, I think it's pretty clear.
Yeah,
right?
And I think it's pretty straightforward. I think Wellum brings out the biblical presentation of Jesus' incarnation and him being a man, and I think he does an excellent job of really speaking about both the outer form, right, the physical body of Christ, how he grew and developed as a human, at the same time really starting to introduce the topic of, well, how is it that this one person is existing in as God and as a man, and his will, his desires, his emotions, and then what does that mean? And so I think we have an introduction, and I think Wellum introduces this in this chapter as well.
Yeah, thinking through, there's really, I think, 2 major categories of understanding Jesus. One is, I'll say this somewhat tentatively, but this is pedagogically how to divide up the subject of Christology. If we look at it in kind of 2 sections, his dual nature, the God and man, that he is both God and man, could be one sort of cluster of issues, and I think these 2 chapters talk about this.
Yeah.
And then the other cluster of issues is, okay, how do the divine nature and the human nature interact?
Yeah.
And then we look at that in the latter chapters that we're going to do for the students will read next week. I haven't fully decided how we're going to divide up the lectures in Christology, but I'm thinking about those, one lecture on that he is God and man, and then another lecture on, okay, how does the God and the man, how do those 2 natures interact? And if you look at historically, which, we're not having the students read the section on history, although that's a great section, and we'll actually cover a lot of that material in the church history class, interestingly. Okay. But if you look at it historically, that's kind of how it developed. First, they were looking at the Arian controversy, and the question was, who is this Jesus? And they just, the Nicene Creed made it clear, this Jesus is God. But then that was clear, or at least it became clear eventually. But then, you look at the next several hundred years, how things developed, you then had to wrestle with, okay, we say this person, Jesus, is God and man, but how does the divine nature and the human nature, how do they exist in one person? And that created a whole other cluster of issues there, where we get into the hypostatic union, the extra Calvinistica, and just various other things that we must look at, and we will look at in the chapters to come. But just overall, how do we divide it up? I think that's important. Page 213, we gesturing toward that issue of the relationship between the 2 natures. He says here, the bottom of 213, similarly, the extraordinary knowledge of Christ is best understood as revelation from his Father through the spirits. Again, this is talking about the incarnation.
Yeah.
It's clarifying what we mean by the incarnation. because, and this also gestures towards that whole other issue too. When we talk about the incarnation, we have to make it clear that he was tempted in all ways like us.
Yes.
Right? So if we don't have a human Christ, we don't have one who was tempted in all ways like us.
Yeah.
Yet without sin,
Yeah.
of course. So in order for Jesus to come and sympathize with humans and save humans, he had to be a real human.
Yeah.
Without in any sense giving up his divinity. So, we have kind of two limiting concepts. Limiting concepts being things that keep us going from a certain direction, that sort of box us in, so that we stay on the right path. On the one hand, we have that ontological priority of his divine nature. It is the divine person who became incarnate. So he is God, and the starting point for understanding him is God. On the other hand, we have to understand the incarnation in such a way that his experience as a human is truly human. Otherwise, we have no salvation. Otherwise, we have no substitutionary death. He took our place, the human place, for divine wrath that we actually deserve. So here he's saying that the extraordinary knowledge of Christ, when he knows things that a person, normal person could not know. In fact, you have 5 husbands, right? Jesus says to the woman at the well. That knowledge is understood as the Father revealing this to the Spirit, so that what we have in the person of Christ is a human functioning, the functionality of a human, the divine person of Christ functioning in his life as a human, so that he is tempted in all ways like us.
Yeah.
Meaning human temptations, knowing what it is like to be tempted as a human, to suffer as a human. That qualifies what we mean by the incarnation. He is truly human in his, not merely human, as the last chapter talks about, but truly human. And that's important to realize. Anything else in this this first section of the biblical presentation of the incarnation?
I highlighted a few things, but one that I would like to bring up here is that on page 214, Wellum says that Jesus indicates that he's his own teaching and his own understanding comes not from the divine nature he shares with the Father, but from the Father to Jesus' human mind and capacity to know, to learn, and to understand. So it doesn't mean that God the Son Jesus was not omniscient. He was omniscient. He preserved his divine self, even in him taking human form. However, as you said in the last statement, it was at certain points God the Father revealed to the Son what is it that he wanted to know, and the Son was obedient to this fact that God the Father was going to reveal certain things and withhold certain kind of knowledge. Right. And yes, this is it's challenging if you don't believe that God exists. It's hard to try to wrap your head around how this could happen. I know we're going to touch upon that. I think in chapter 13 you touched upon that. Yeah.
We're getting ready for that one. That's going to be a tough one. So we're doing all we can to sort of lay the groundwork for how to actually understand that chapter. But good. What else do you have underlined here?
He speaks about just how we can't deny the fact that Jesus Christ has a human will.
Yes.
Right? And we learn again in chapter 13 how the will really exists in an individual's nature and not necessarily in your person.
Yes.
Right? So yes, Jesus Christ was fully human. He had the human experience. He thought as a human. He learned as a human. He grew and understood as a human. He had that human will. At the same time, he had a divine will. But we must not deny the fact that he had a distinct human will, because that is a part of the human experience.
Right. And that is a part of human temptation.
Exactly.
That is a part of human. His whole human existence required the unique human will, that he can be tempted in all ways like us.
Yeah.
And at the same, that's why we need to understand he has two wills, because he is God, so he wills as God.
Yes.
The willingness to be incarnate is the willingness of God within the Trinitarian life, where the Son obediently comes to earth to be incarnate, is the will of God. Then he acts in his incarnate nature through the will of man, and those two wills can they must be held in distinction.
Yes.
As his divine and human nature must be held in distinction.
Yes.
Yeah. That was confusing for me for a long time, because I thought, man, how can we say that he has two wills without end up with a schizophrenic Jesus?
Yeah.
I don't understand how this works out. And it seems so natural to understand will and as the person, connected to the person, and yet as I read about it more, I was convinced that will needs to go with the nature.
Absolutely.
And we need to understand two wills.
Absolutely. And I think those who are kind of new to theology, I think it's important that sometimes we reserve things kind of just for our faith. We just have this kind of blanket, yes, I believe in Christ, without being able to really articulate our position.
Yeah.
And I think these terms and really thinking through what it means to be human allows us to better communicate our theology and our Christology.
Yeah.
Our ability to share what we believe with anybody.
Right.
On common grounds.
Right.
And not just reserving it for faith.
Right.
And for this kind of abstract belief.
Yeah.
And I say abstract in just in the sense of belief being something that you as an individual have, but at the same time we were able to communicate our belief.
Yeah. That our belief has content to it.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. When we say we believe in Jesus, it's not just this. You're right. Abstract. Jesus and something, and then without any content.
Yeah.
There's mystery, obviously.
Yeah.
But that mystery has content to it, and we want to articulate the content.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think you're right. It's important for to say I believe in Jesus, but if we can't know who Jesus is, that makes that category for Jesus empty.
Exactly.
Right. It's also important for just our Christian life, and I think it's even how we want to talk to how I want to talk to my kids about Jesus. The two wills, for instance, how can you get more esoteric or abstract or theological than talking about the two wills of Jesus? And yet, that understanding of the human will is so essential. When my kids, for instance, are being tempted to anger or something like that, they're being tempted to lose it and whack their sibling, whatever. They're tempted to just not have self-control. Self-control is one thing that we want to talk about a lot as parents. Understanding that Jesus experienced those temptations.
Yeah.
I mean, to think through the humanity of Jesus, that he knew what it was like to be tempted, not to have self-control when speaking to Satan, or when the disciples just didn't get it over and over and over again.
Yeah.
That he knew what it was like and tempted in that way, and that gives us, you can use that, and I think that truth can be used in an abusive way if we say, now you just need to be like Jesus. It doesn't work. We say, and he was obedient for you, right? He was obedient in the very particulars in which you are struggling to be obedient.
Exactly.
He was obedient in those particular ways for you, and now through his Spirit, he wants you to be obedient in those particular ways as well.
Yeah.
So just the two wills of Jesus is applicable for parenting, and that's that's important.
Yeah.
Well, moving on then. Why God became man? The famous Anselm of Canterbury asked that question. Why did God become man? And Anselm is the medieval period. You can just kind of see a progression in church history. Early church fathers wrestled with the question, how did God become man? And then we answer the question, why did God become man? So you see sort of a different orientation there. Point that out. We'll talk about that more in the church history side of the things, but that's important just to just notice this in other realms as well. Why did God become man?
And the answer, on page 217, Wellum puts the answer that God the Son became man to fulfill God's plan to save sinners by making satisfaction for their sin. Now, these particulars is what we're going through in this book, but that's the simple answer, is that it was a part of God's original plan to redeem fallen humanity because of the penalty and wage of sin, which is death.
And you're right. And then we have several things: the biblical rationale for the incarnation. I know this section is long, a little bit repetitive, but really, really important to hammer this point home. And I really appreciated it too, because so much of it is built on the book of Hebrews.
Yeah.
Which is a book I love. I spent 2 years preaching through it at my church.
Oh wow.
And
nice.
Just really, really enjoyed the book a lot. And this section that he quotes it at length, chapter 2, verses 5 through 18. It's just a beautiful section there that explains the absolute necessity for him to become human, and then the solidarity that exists between him and us. In his humanity. I think he alludes to this a little bit, but one of my favorite themes in the Bible is union with Christ, and the union is built upon the incarnation. There has to be first a union between the divine and human nature, so then there can be a union. That's a union of person. The divine nature and human nature are united in the one person. So union in the person of Christ, so that then there can be a spiritual union between Christ and his people. Without Jesus becoming man, or rather, put it this way, without the Son of God becoming man, then he would not be able to be united with us.
And then another topic that I think Wellum does a good job at really ironing out throughout his book, but also kind of on page 220, is that connection between the first Adam and Jesus Christ being the last Adam. And how in the ways in which the first Adam failed is the reason why Jesus Christ came and is the last Adam, because the first Adam, who was supposed to represent all of humanity, did not do so in the way that he was supposed to, and so Jesus Christ is now presented as the antitype of that Adam. He is the representative human being, on page 220, whose obedient humiliation and his incarnation and death merited his exaltation, that he would share with his people. The union that you were speaking about is because he is now our representative, because he's able to identify with the human experience, with the human suffering, and so therefore he's able to kind of advocate on our behalf to the Father. His righteousness has become our righteousness. In 1 Corinthians, and so therefore we're able now to kind of live through Christ in the Spirit.
Oh, very, very well said. It sounds like a sermon. You can preach that. I appreciate that. I remember Sinclair Ferguson, theologian I respect a lot, making the point one time, I think he was quoting Herman Bavinck, that we need to realize that we need human righteousness. If we had God's righteousness imputed to us, it would just destroy us. We can't have God's righteousness given to us. That would be a holiness that would just not, we couldn't handle it. That would not be salvation. That would be like utter destruction or something like that. Just blow us up. Angelic righteousness isn't going to do us any good either. We need human righteousness, and the only way to get human righteousness is through a true human who lives a perfect life and dies on the cross for us. So that is absolutely essential. It's good. And I think this section too, more than any other that we've seen so far, underscores why Wellum began with the other chapters we looked at before about the redemptive history. and the biblical theology and what God is doing from the very beginning and how Christ fits into those roles.
Yeah.
Right. So the whole idea that there needs to be a human king, right? So David was a king, and God's creating a human on the throne, just like Adam and Eve were going to rule over the world. Well, there needs to be a human who's doing that, and that human is Jesus. So there's all sorts of biblical categories why the one who comes to save must be a human, because of what God is doing from the very beginning. Yeah, you said it very well. So, and he also quotes, what was said in the language of the early church, page 223. He could not redeem what he did not assume, or what is not assumed is not healed, as some people say. And that, therefore, he had to be made like us in every respect
in order to redeem us.
Yeah. Another reason why, consider the two wills. Human will must be redeemed.
Yeah. Human
will is broken. So the whole way of willing then must be redeemed in Christ. Yeah. Yeah. So then we have the. Let's jump over here to the sinlessness of Jesus. Yeah. He was tempted in all ways like us, yet without sin. Absolutely critical distinction.
Yeah, and the Bible is very explicit in its statement of, or its assertion that Jesus Christ did not sin.
Yeah,
and they're very, very explicit statements listed in the text that states that, hey, he who was not sin became sin for us, right? That's in Romans.
Right.
So that's, again, when you think about epistemology and how we know that, how we get to know who this Jesus is, well, we use the Bible in order to gain this knowledge about who he is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And I think the sinlessness of Jesus puts to rest once for all the false, the excuse some people try to make for their sin. Well, I'm human.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Right? To be human is to err. Well, no. Jesus was fully human, and he did not sin. So we cannot think that being human is an excuse to sin. Being human means we're finite, and Jesus, in that sense, lived as a finite human, not merely a finite human, but was, he experienced that.
Yeah.
He knew what it was like to thirst, to be hungry, to not know things. So yes, to be human is to be in a place where we can experience temptation, and where we are exposed to the possibility of suffering. But it does not entail sin.
Exactly. Yeah, and we're empowered by the Spirit to be obedient.
Yeah.
And to avoid sin.
Yeah.
And I think I'm always inspired by Jesus' testimony of Nathaniel, where he says, "Behold, a man in whom there is no guile."
Right.
And so, if you ever are in doubt, trust that through His Spirit, we have the ability not to choose sin.
Right. Yeah, we are able not to sin.
Yeah.
Now, it doesn't mean we will all the time. But outside of Christ, we are not able not to sin.
You're prone to it.
Yeah. But now we are able not to sin. Yeah, it's good. Well, and then we have this section, sinlessness but fallen, page 232, 233. This was a good section. There was a time where I think I tried to actually take the wrong view here, where I tried to explain Jesus as inhabiting a fallen nature, and I think I was doing that for good motives. And Cranefield is a good theologian here and holds that view. I don't think it's inherently heretical in terms of how it's actually explained, because we want to be able to say that he was
part of humanity.
Yeah, and he came down and entered into our world and then lifts us to something higher, right? So he takes us from where we are to something greater. And when we're thinking that way, which is a right way to think, then I think it's tempting to say that, well, he enters into the fallenness of our human experience to then redeem us out of that.
Yeah.
And I can see why there's a temptation to go there, but yeah, it's best not to go there.
Exactly.
And recognize that his nature is sinless. Now that doesn't mean that he cannot be tempted. I mean, Adam and Eve had a sinless nature, and yet they were still tempted.
Yeah.
So there doesn't mean that he can't actually experience temptation just because he has a sinless nature. Nevertheless, yeah, it is best to say that he's not in any sense fallen. His humanity is distinct from that, and yet he still, experiences death. So he still is united to our sinful nature in terms of his as a representation for us. He still becomes sin in the sense that he then is susceptible to death and bears the wrath of God on the cross. And in so doing, then he lifts us out of that.
Yeah.
Out of that state.
Yeah. And I think Wellum says on page 234 to that point that making fallenness essential to humanity entails that humanity created by God must necessarily sin, which is not the case. Yeah. That God said in Genesis chapter 1 that everything he made was very good.
Yeah.
And so sin was not essential to the plight of humanity. It is something that occurred as a result of Adam and Eve's fall. However, it wasn't essential to being human.
Yeah.
And so therefore, we have the person of Christ who assumed human nature and was able to live this sinless life.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. There's a lawnmower. It's getting a little bit loud. Well, let's go ahead and wrap this section up. We have just the accounts of the virgin birth, yeah, as being a essential doctrine,
and its plausibility.
Yes, yeah. And I think that just gets to creation. I mean, God can, Jesus is born of a woman, and the assumption there is that anything born of a woman is a true human, right? What is born of a woman is not an animal. What's born of a woman is a true human.
Yeah.
So true human DNA, born of a woman. But the fact that that it's a virgin birth shows that he did not come from simply. His identity is not simply from humanity.
Yeah.
So that yes, true human in terms of his experience, but not in terms of his origin. And that's important to see. And I think that's what the virgin conception clearly shows. Good. Well, again, I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Here, page 240. I just highlighted this and said good summary here at the top of page 240. Just read this to close this section out. The all-glorious Creator, covenant Lord, assumed a full and sinless human nature, such that the eternal Son became a man in order to restore humanity to its vice-regent glory and to inaugurate the new creation over which the new humanity will rule in righteousness in the age to come. In this way and by these glorious means, our Lord Jesus Christ becomes our great prophet, priest, and king, the head of the new creation, the Lord of glory, who is worthy of all our worship, adoration, and praise. In fact, it is only as God, the incarnate, that Jesus can achieve this great work for us. To deny either Christ's deity or his humanity, it's deny the Jesus of the Bible and to rob us of our Redeemer.
Yeah. He's fully God and fully man. Praise be to his name.
Yeah. Amen. Amen.